record. Okay, welcome to the December 1st meeting of the Kubernetes VMware User Group. On the agenda today, I'll present briefly on a couple updates that happened since the last meeting. Those are updates to the vSphere CSI storage plugin and also the vSphere cloud provider. There's likely to be a lot of time after, so we can just have free form birds of a feather discussion, whatever people like after that. And I see we got a third person who just joined. Welcome. I don't recognize your name, but welcome. So let me, I prepared a deck for these changes, so let me bring that up just a minute. Okay, and I assume, can you see the slide deck?
Yep.
Okay. So, like I said, we'll cover the storage driver, the cloud provider, briefly touched on vSphere 8. An update to the CSI driver came out, I think about a month ago. The key feature was adding support for Kubernetes 1.25. That's the latest version of Kubernetes that is currently in GA right now. And it supports 1.2.5 with a minimum of 1.2.3. One thing that I want to throw out there, the reason I mentioned the minimum, is that Datadog does this annual survey of Kubernetes users, and it came out in November. Found it quite interesting that according to the survey, which had quite a large participation, the most commonly deployed Kubernetes release out there in the wild is 1.2.1, which reached end of life earlier this year. So there's a big difference, I think, between aspirations in the real world and reality. But in any event, support for 1.2.5 is out there if you want to be in that group of apparently what are early adopters. And by the way, the 1.2.6 release is due out later this month. So, and I'd expect that VMware will publish storage plugins and a cloud provider sometime after that release. Wouldn't surprise me if that doesn't come out until early next year. But anyway, here's the CSI driver update. It enabled a feature gate. Well, you can read the things in the slide. A key resolved issue was fixing an issue that occurred when a Kubernetes node VM was deleted while volume mounts were mounted to that VM, and that should make the world a better place to live, fixing that issue. Patch releases also came out if you're on older Kubernetes releases to 2.6.2 and 2.54. And you can see the list of those patches here. By the way, I think I listed in the earlier slide that if you want any of these, including the latest issues, go to this link at the top here, and then the latest documentation is found here. So known issues, you should go to the GitHub for the very latest. The release notes publish the known issues as of the date of the release. And there's a few of them there. The ones that are in the release notes often have workarounds. If you're unfamiliar with it, if you go to GitHub, those can be very fresh issues, maybe that haven't been investigated yet. I just looked this morning, for example, and the last one was reported just 2 days ago. With regard to the cloud provider, we've got a similar thing going on where support for Kubernetes 1.25 came out. There was the recommended means of deploying that cloud provider, if you're on a generic Kubernetes release that doesn't have an installer for vSphere, the help chart would be recommended for installing that cloud provider. If you're on a commercial distribution, they would typically take care of this for you. But for people who are on upstream open source or Kubernetes distros without an installer, that help chart should be useful. There haven't been any recent patch releases, and just for completeness, latest docs are here and current issues are there. I looked this morning and there hasn't been an issue open for 22 days. So there's not a whole lot fresh going on there other than the Kubernetes 1.25 release. These are some additional, in addition to supporting 1.25, here is the list of issues resolved in that 1.25 release. You can go over those after the meeting yourself to find if any of these might apply to you. Finally, vSphere 8 was announced at VMware Explore earlier this year, was originally projected to go GA in late September, but issues were found in that process. It got delayed a bit, but it did go GA on November 17th. I've got a link here. And by the way, I'll drop a link to this slide deck after this meeting in the agenda notes document, so you can find clickable versions of these links. If you're not keeping up with me taking notes now, I'll put them in there a little bit after the meeting ends. If you're not familiar with what is in vSphere 8, I recommend this Cormac Hogan blog post as a good summary. And then for the North America version of Explore, William Lamb has posted a list of links to video recordings of those sessions. He usually does one for KubeCon or for VMware Explorer Europe as well, but I don't believe that is out yet, but maybe soon. However, I don't think with regard to vSphere 8, much changed in between the two of them. So you should be able to find sessions on vSphere 8 in Explore. Unfortunately, I can't tell you a lot more about vSphere 8 based on personal experience because I haven't had a chance to use it myself yet. I normally play around with these things in my home lab, but I'm either going to have to spend some money to upgrade my home lab or do without, because right now I don't have modern enough equipment to deploy vSphere 8 on my home lab. I think that was the end of my deck. So let me stop sharing here. So anyway, that was the end of my the presentation on the agenda, but as usual, and we've got a lot of time left here, we can go into just free-form birds of a feather discussion, or if anybody's got any questions, inquiries, curiosities, you're welcome to go for it. Maybe if you want, we can all introduce each other as well. I'm Steve Wong. I work for VMware as a software engineer. I'm assigned to work on open source projects, including Kubernetes. I'm also fairly active in the edge space. And I've been active on the Kubernetes project since 2016.
I can go now, I guess.
Okay.
I'm Kyle Dunn. I'm a global support engineer for Tanzu, all the Tanzu products. I used to work on TSM, but not so much anymore. But if anyone has a case with Tanzu in America, it's most likely going to run into me.
Okay.
At one point or another. Yeah, so I worked on Tanzu when it was in its infancy, and then when it became like a full-fledged product, to move to that support team.
And I see you, Damien. If you don't want to talk or aren't able to, that's fine. But if you'd like to introduce yourself, go for it. Okay, I'll take silence as unavailable. Yeah, speaking of Tanzu, yeah, until recently I was working on the Tanzu Community Edition. That was recently end of life in favor of recommending that people just go for the free edition of TKG instead. And I've also had experience just evaluating other distros of Kubernetes. When I was at KubeCon North America, I was originally slated to give a talk where I chose to use Tanzu Community Edition, but when it became apparent it was going to be end of life, I flipped over at the last minute to use EKS Anywhere on top of vSphere, and it was interesting, and it worked nicely for demo purposes.
Do they still have like an active channel in the Kubernetes Slack for TCE?
I don't know how active it is. Let me click on it now that you mention it. I haven't gone there myself recently. And I suspect that it isn't active, but I don't actually know.
Yeah, I know that they still have like, I looked yesterday and they had like 6 or 7 open issues, but I don't know if
Okay.
anyone's actually like looking at them, I guess.
Yeah, I doubt it because pretty much most of the staff that was assigned to it has moved on.
Mhm.
So, and I would suspect that there isn't any, unless the community goes in there and does it, which is probably in the long term unlikely. I think this is just going to flip over to people would use the free commercial version of Tanzu or some other Kubernetes solution. There just aren't engineers staffed by VMware to address issues in it.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, like it wasn't like a very long stint, or I guess it depends on what you categorize as long.
And I do
Long
know
enough to
that
get
the
enough
community meetings they were holding have been canceled as well.
Yeah. I only asked because it was top of mind because we had somebody who like created a case for TKG or some other product and they were trying to use TCE.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, oh, that's a bummer. They're kind of like near the end of life, trying to adopt it right at the end of life.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I don't know what to tell you. If you go to the old TKG site, the official VMware corporate messaging is there. So I don't want to contradict what is there.
Yeah.
But it gives links to the recommendation of using the free edition and instructions on where to download it. I don't know if it's been resolved, but I think as of early October, I had heard people indicate that one of the potential things with impediments to moving over to the TKG might be the solution with regard to the load balancer, where the community edition had some solutions built in, and it isn't as apparent as to what you do to swap those parts out if you were to move to the free edition of TKG.
Yeah, I mean, I never looked at it myself until like recently. I knew it was there. It's interesting to hear someone who was like in direct relation to it.
Mm-hmm. So I don't have any other material. Is there anything you've come across interesting or just want to chat about? I've got no problem with just ending the meeting early, but I'm open to discuss just about anything.
I saw something about Entrea that was like a blog that I thought was interesting. Let me see if I can find it.
Yeah, if you could put it, I'm curious if you want to drop a link to it in the chat.
Yeah, give me a second. It might take me a second to find. I found it. Wow, that was easy. I didn't like read fully, but I thought it was like interesting enough to click on.
Okay.
Entria egress vSphere 8.
Oh yeah, that um yeah, I think that space inside Kubernetes is kind of interesting, where both egress and ingress have a fair amount of activity going on.
Yeah, this
I,
is I think it requires you to have NSX routed stuff too, though. So it's not like just pure Entrea, or at least from what I'm reading by a glance.
Yeah, I think that there's also an opportunity with Entrea to potentially use some of the features found in it to do things that might ordinarily fall into the space of load balancers and ingress. And I was just talking to somebody trying to put together a CFP for an upcoming conference about the gateway API that's coming out in Kubernetes. So, Kubernetes had this ingress feature that was designed so that you could multiplex HTTP, HTTPS service exposure to share IPs in clouds where, maybe you're paying a fair amount of money per public IP. So there's some value in multiplexing those. And the ingress spec came out in Kubernetes, has been out there for years, but I think some could make the argument that it was not full featured enough, or maybe in other regards a little too loose, so that you had variations that cause situations where things really weren't that portable. You'd end up having your YAML specs for services locked into your particular ingress provider. And if you move to some alternate location that used a different ingress, things would have to be changed. And I'm told that the gateway API is going to be kind of the version 2 of this, to come out with better standardization. And it'll be interesting to see whether ingresses themselves adapt to that, or maybe some of the more full-featured CNIs like Entrea can fit into that space as well.
Yeah, I like the development of Entrea to kind of move into like being able to do NCP stuff as well. I think that's like their overall goal, I guess. Or so like you can, like for TKGM, you can't, or Tanzu Kubernetes Grid multi-cloud, you can't use like NSXT with it as like a direct connection. It can be like the underlay network, but it'd be interesting, kind of like in the older versions there, it can use some of the NCP functionality to do stuff in NSXT for you.
Yeah, I think I'm going to have to take a pass and go do some personal education on playing around with Entrea again to explore some of these, because they seem to be pretty aggressive at adding features to that, more aggressive than I am at taking the time to deploy it and try it out.
Yeah, it's like this and the stuff in it, the Entrea CNI, and then like cluster class stuff that I have to still like look at. It might be a little late to the party for the cluster class stuff.
Yeah. So just out of curiosity, where are you based, Kyle?
I live in Denver, and I work
Okay.
out of like either the Denver office or the Broomfield office. So like the Broomfield office is the global support main office in right outside of Denver, like in America. So
I'm kind of curious and bring it up because I am a program committee chair of an open source conference called Scale that is based in Los Angeles. And we've got CFPs open till the end of the week if you have an inkling to present at an open source conference. Denver to LA isn't too big of a trip.
Nah, I just have to figure out what to present, I guess.
Yeah, the Scale conference it is definitely open source. So,
Mhm.
sales pitches on commercial product is frowned upon.
Yeah, I
But
get
if
you.
you can come up with kind of a best practices talk on Kubernetes generically that could apply to anything,
Mhm.
and Antria is, of course, open source. You could go for that. We're aspiring to it coming back to the pre-COVID days where the registration peaked at about 4,500 people. So
Mhm.
it's fairly big. I think it's described as the largest independent open source conference in North America.
Yeah. Oh,
And there's a 2-day track on containers that is also being labeled as a Kubernetes community day. So it's uh, going to be cross promoted by the CNCF.
yeah, that's interesting because like, like I joined this one and like in the beginning, there's a lot of different people who had different ideas and it wasn't all about Tanzu, which is like, sometimes you get stuck in the loop of like, oh, I work on Tanzu stuff. So all I want to talk about is Tanzu stuff. But like people like Scott, when he would come, Scott Rosenberg, like, and come and talk about like different things he's done in Tanzu, like that was always like the drive to make sure to attend the meetings and meet like people like that who have taken like, yeah, they use Tanzu, but they use everything else around it.
Yeah, and the fact is that the bulk of Tanzu, I would contend, is built on upstream open source. It's just, uh, something where you've got vetted, controlled builds of these things with support. But by and large, the things you can do in there should be reproducible in generic open source Kubernetes. That isn't quite true when you drift into things like using NSX or vSphere specific features. But uh, much of what would go on there is applicable across the board.
Yeah, definitely. And like same thing with like cluster API stuff. Like
Mhm.
all of Tanzu, pretty much, except for TKGI, would
Uh-huh.
be utilizing cluster API, which is like the most interesting part, I think. Taking something like that big open source and like basically just saying like we're going to use this and help develop it in open source and like downstream use it as part of our product.
But anyway, I dropped a link to that Scale conference CFP in the chat if you might be curious, and
Definitely.
take a look at it. There are actually, I think, a dozen tracks. One of them is just labeled general. So as long as it's open source, if you've got anything, you should be able to fit it in one of those categories. And it's kind of a fun conference. One of the other things that's a little different about it is that it goes Thursday through the weekend, and on the weekend, um, people are actually encouraged to bring along their families. So there's a track for under 18 people on Saturday that has presenters who are under age 18. And there are also sessions intended to appeal to people just getting started and learning. So that's something I haven't seen in any other conference, but it makes Scale a little unusual.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's kind of like I don't know. The only other thing that I have relation to that actually does that is probably like DEF CON, where they have like
Mhm.
kids days.
Okay, well, I'll take a look at that Antria link. That looks intriguing. And
Mhm.
I don't have anything else to bring up myself, unless you do. Maybe we'll end this meeting a little early this time.
No, like that's the only thing I could think of that might be like interesting enough to discuss. So I'll have to read it as well because I don't think I
Okay.
did. But we could probably talk about it next time as well.
All right. Okay. Well, thanks everybody for attending, and we'll see you next time.
All right.
Bye.
Have a good day. Bye.